Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And we're all about overcoming obstacles on the show. And I have got a guest who has such a powerful story to share today. His name is Max Friedman. He is an author, a retired corporate communicator, a memoir writer, and second-generation Holocaust survivor. His book titled Painful Joy, a Holocaust Family Memoir, is part memoir, part genealogical mystery, and part history, which explores the complicated relationship of two Holocaust survivors who experience the painful joy of a love touched by death. Max, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
What a story.
Yeah, it took me, I'm 72 years young or old now, and it took me till I was about 66 to even contemplate the idea of putting something down on paper about what happened to my parents and what happened to my sister and to me as a result of what happened to them. Uh, and for most of my life, you had said that I'm a second generation Holocaust survivor. And that basically meant that I survived my parents' survival.
Mm-hmm.
It was very difficult. They had lost everybody in their family, everybody, hundreds and hundreds of people. My father lost his wife and two little daughters. My mother lost her husband, her brothers, her parents, everyone. Uh, in when we talk about the Holocaust, we usually don't even say lost or killed; we say murdered,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of the time, when we were growing up, uh, we found ourselves as what I would call child parents. We were taking care of our parents. They were not able to take care of us. They had suffered so much and lost so much that mentally and even physically, they were damaged. And so the idea of revisiting any of that, since we experienced it firsthand as we were growing up, and it left its marks, which I can talk about later, was too painful. It was
Mm-hmm.
too painful to ask them to tell us more, and it was too painful for us to even want to know more. And in fact, this book only came about because I had, in my career, had just written two memoirs for two other people uh, who had very interesting lives, and they were self-published. This wasn't. This was published by Amsterdam publishers, but for them, I wrote their memoirs. I spent 2 years writing each of the two memoirs. And my grandson, who was, I guess, 8 at the time, came to us one day and asked me about the idea of survival. I had talked to him briefly about my mother, what would have been his great grandmother, and how difficult her life was. Especially when at times he would come to us and say, this or that happened and I'm upset and I wish it weren't this way. And I would say, well, you'll get over it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, look at me. I do pretty well. You like me. I like you. We love each other. We have a good time together. So surviving is just something that you do in life sometimes when things are tough. And so he said, so if you're a survivor because your parents are survivors, then my dad is also a survivor. And that means that I can be a survivor, right? And what actually does that mean? And I said, I don't really know. Because I just lived being a survivor, but I didn't actually consciously know what I was doing or why I was doing it. And so we being my wife and I, spent 5 years researching the lives of my parents and visiting Poland and Israel and Germany and Sweden. My sister and I were born in Sweden, and my parents actually met there after their liberation from concentration camps. And we met actually a niece of my father that we never knew he had or we had, or from his first marriage, and who actually works at the Holocaust Memorial site in Jerusalem, of all places. And it was just one surprise after another, one tearful experience after another, and one joyful experience in the sense of discovering something, discovering all kinds of things, good and bad, things that I thought I knew, things that I thought were true and that they weren't. We can go into some of the surprises, but it was an extraordinary journey. And even as I talk about it, sometimes I sort of get sort of hard to say, because once you know the names of people who've been lost and murdered, and once I found out the name of my father's first children, and that day, they suddenly become real. They suddenly, and his wife, and I found actually a picture of his wife, his first wife, and suddenly the story takes on a totally different dimension. And I think the book, Painful Joy, tries to create that kind of experience for the reader. I think it's very important for us not to talk about the Holocaust in terms of 6 million this and millions of that, and there were 38 concentration camps and hundreds of slave labor camps and God knows what else. It's talking about individual people who, for no reason at all, were murdered. And again and again, and not only murdered. I had asked an expert in this area once and said, well, if they were so interested in getting rid of all these Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and political prisoners and the mentally ill, all those people were targets. Why didn't they just shoot them? Shoot them all. Why do you put them in a camp? Why do you torture them for years? Why do you starve them to near death or to death? Why do you beat them? For years, my father was in slave labor camps and concentration camps from 1939 to 1945. He and my mother were one of only about 3 to 4% of all the Polish Jews to have survived that. God knows how, but maybe my grandson was right. There's something in your genes. There's something in your head that allows you to do that. And again, we can talk about it. I have a few ideas as how they manage. But why didn't they just, and his response was that it became a religious thing almost. It became, the war could not be won without the Jews being destroyed. That was the reason why ultimately they built the camps, they built the extermination plants, because early on in the 30s, when Hitler was coming to power, there wasn't a big plan to do any of this. There was a plan to get rid of the Jews as best they can, and mostly to seize whatever monies or property they had. That was the original plan. And then it developed into a much more ideological, almost religious or anti-religious experience for the German authorities, for the soldiers, for perhaps many, many German people as well, because they lived near these camps. Presumably, they knew something was going on, but they accepted it, and so they built them with the idea that basically they were going to allow these people to work until they died. And if they needed to hasten their deaths, they would. One of my mother's brothers he survived the camp. He was in Buchenwald. He survived till 3 days before the liberation, and
Oh,
then they put a needle into his heart, and
oh.
that was it. So it was the extraordinarily monstrosity of the human spirit, along with the extraordinary uh, magic of the human spirit, to actually come through that and start all over again and try to recover, or if not recover, cover over maybe
Mhm.
all the pain and the suffering and the loss, and start a new life if you can. And unfortunately, you never can start, as the title of the book, Painful Joy.
Mhm.
It when how much, what kind of love is there that's touched by death?
Mhm.
And it's a different kind of love.
That level of trauma is incomprehensible. And the fact that as this was going on, the people were just like, oh, well, whatever. Everybody just seemed to either accept it or, turn away from it or turn a blind eye toward it. But it was happening at such a high level and it was so obvious, but nobody stepped up to stop it. And that
No,
to me is
yeah,
something that I just don't understand how anybody could see and watch what was happening and maybe just close their door and say, well, it's not me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and unfortunately, that's the legacy of what happened, is wondering, not only can it happen again, can it happen again, because it happens in parts of the world in different ways already, uh, but what is the point unless you try to let people know that they have a responsibility, that we all have a responsibility to speak out, to
Mm-hmm.
do something, even if it was something, for example, uh, after it was clear that the Jews were being targeted in Germany and in Austria. Uh, there was a big meeting of all the foreign ministers of all the European countries, including the Americans, to say, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to get the Jews out? Or how many are you willing to take in your country? And how many are you willing to take in your country? And indeed, every country said, this is a good idea. And not one country said that they would take any more. And that was it. So it was 1938, 1939, and all the countries of Europe, all the civilized countries, uh, Britain had Palestine, they closed the borders there. America said no. And even though they had a quota system, the quota was never even reached. Even the quota system would have allowed thousands more to come.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they just said, not us. And
It's
it's
interesting that you
extraordinary.
you use that word, the civilized countries all got together, because that certainly doesn't sound like being civilized to me. You would think that they would do whatever they could
No,
to step
and
up
that,
and help
yeah,
people get out.
yeah. And I think that goes to the core of what hate can do.
Mm-hmm.
What hate can do when you're brought up with hate, when you're
Mm-hmm.
brought up with racism, when you're brought up with thinking that there are tiers of human beings
Mm-hmm.
at different levels, and there are some that are not worth the same as others. When blacks were worth 2/3 of a white person
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, so it just feeds on itself, and it becomes normal.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-Semitism in Poland had been around for quite a long time. It was just ingrained into the society. Uh, People lived next to each other. The Jews lived next to Catholics, and they interacted, uh, but for the most part they lived separately as well, and they came to believe things about each other. in a way that was harmful. But the Jews were the minority in that, and the ones not in power. And so the ones in power used it to their own ends. They used it as a way to divert from the problems that Poland was a fairly backward country compared to other countries in Europe at the time, much more agrarian, much less industrialized. The Jews were mostly lived separately in their little parts of their village. They were the shopkeepers. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't even allowed to be farmers if they wanted to be.
Wow.
So there was a separation, similar in some ways, different in other ways, with what happened, let's say, in South Africa with apartheid, but or with America in before the Civil Rights era. So it was just the way you grew up, and it was official policy by the late 1930s in Poland to reduce the Jewish population by 85%, because the Jews, while they were mostly the common thought that people think about the Jews is that, well, they had money or they this that. A very, very tiny minority were professionals or even shopkeepers who had significant amounts of money. Mostly they were just living day to day, serving their own communities in large measure. And most of them were poverty stricken. And most of them weren't even allowed to work in factories either, which is one of the reasons why they took up shops and other kinds of activities. But by those years, the Polish government said, we're going to get the Jews out of here. They represent competitors to the other shopkeepers. Their prices are lower and whatever. So they started to look for places to take the Jews, and they seriously explored sending them to Madagascar, to the island of Madagascar. So that was a big idea. When Hitler heard of that and thought it was a great idea. The French heard of that and thought it was a great idea. And they started to explore that. And it turned out that Madagascar mostly had jungles. They could support maybe a few thousand new people. I mean, it was a stupid idea. Yet that's what the Poles were thinking. And in fact, the Polish government started arming Jewish guerrilla fighters who wanted to go to Israel. So they actually they armed the Haganah and the armed wing of the Jewish movement, the Zionist movement, to settle in Palestine, and the British got very upset about all that, because the British basically had decided that they weren't going to allow any more Jews in, and Poland decided, but we want to get rid of them. We have to send them somewhere. And so what ended up happening is in 1939, in 1938, there were gigantic economic boycotts of Jewish stores, violent boycotts. And Jews suffered greatly. And after the boycotts, they were even more impoverished than before. And at that point, Hitler invaded. And then the story got so much worse than anyone could have imagined. And, one always thinks about, when do you know it's time to get out? Right? I asked this friend of mine who studied the Holocaust, and I asked him, why did my father marry someone and have at least his first child? In 1938, he had his first child. And I said, didn't he see what was going on? Why would he start a family at that point? And my friend said, what did you want him to do? He had nowhere to go.
Right.
I mean, there was nothing for him except to make believe that life will go on.
Wow.
And unfortunately, it didn't.
So his little girls were very young.
Yeah, so his first child was born in 1938. Um, uh,
Wow.
her name was Ada. And his second child was born in 1941 in the ghetto already,
Mm-hmm.
in the town that he was living in.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he was in slave labor camps, in those early years, there was a very large enterprise that was officially run by the, I think, chief of police of one of the German cities. Uh, and they lent out, they established labor camps, slave labor camps, and sent the Jews there to work for German industry,
Mm-hmm.
or in the armaments industry, in the construction industry. And so my father uh, was sent out within weeks of his town being taken over by the Germans.
Wow.
And at that point, they allowed workers to come back on leave for like special holidays because they needed them. They
Mm-hmm.
Even though the conditions were pretty bad, in some cases horrible, uh, the first year or two they were seriously deciding whether to kill all the Jews quickly or to let them die by working them to death.
Oh.
And so the working thing to death seemed to win out, or for at least part of it. And so he came back, and that's how they had a second daughter that was born in 1941. Uh, then, sadly, the his wife and two little girls were taken to Auschwitz in 1940, in August of 1942,
Mm.
and they were killed, murdered there. And he was in a concentration camp by then in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
The slave
Mm-hmm.
labor camp days were over, and it was just working them to death, but just without very much purpose except
Mm-hmm.
for them to die.
So once they were liberated
Yeah,
and he ended up in Sweden, I mean, what was that transition like? I mean, did he tell you that? There's a little bit, I did read the prologue or the introduction of your book,
right.
and it does kind of illustrate, or what he went through, or he seemed like such a gentle man, a gentle
Yeah,
spirit, even
he
through
was
all
always a
this.
very sweet person, but he was tormented, I think,
Mhm.
and uh, he never talked about anything. I didn't, until I started doing this research. I didn't know. I knew they had a wife and children. I didn't know
Mhm.
their names. I didn't know how old they were. I don't know when they died, how they died, except that they had been killed during the war. Uh, I didn't know anything about his own life before the war. I didn't know that he had lost his father when his father died suddenly when uh, he was 4 years old, and he became the breadwinner in the family when he was 12.
Wow.
So he finished 6 years of grade school, and then he went out to work. He
Mhm.
had three sisters and a younger brother. He had two older brothers who died early in their lives. So, so I didn't know any of that. He never talked about any of that, and the only time he ever talked to me was for 20 minutes when I was 20 years old. I this was during the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
and I got at that point I was a student and in college. I was going into my senior year, and uh, my my lottery number, at that point there were lotteries because they
Mhm.
ran out of soldiers, so they were taking students now.
Mhm.
And if you got a good number, you were lucky, and if you didn't get a good number, you were not that lucky. So I found out somewhere that if I could prove an emotional attachment that was so significant for some reason to me by my parents, that I could get what was called an emotional deferment. So I told my father, you have to tell me something about what happened to you because I have to write a statement for you.
Mhm.
And he reluctantly said, okay. And we sat down. We were living in Brighton Beach, which is sort of an enclave in southern Brooklyn near Coney Island, which is where we grew up. And he talked to me for 20 minutes. And he told me about the last time he saw his wife and children. And it was a beautiful story. At the end of the day, they were hiding out, he said, and he went out to forage for some food because they had been told the next day to assemble in the town square with one piece of luggage.
Oh.
And they knew something was up. This was August of 1942. So he took his family and they hid out somewhere. He went out for food. When he got back, they were gone. Oh. And the only thing that was left was his wife's sweater on the floor. So he said he took that sweater with him. He didn't know what had happened to him. He assumed the worst, but he didn't know that. And he carried that sweater with him, he said, for the rest of the war in the camps. And then at the end of the war, he was on a death march, another wonderful experience. The Germans, again, were trying to get rid of all the evidence of what they had done in all the camps. And so survivors were being sent to the east, to other German cities further east, because the Allies, the British and the Russians were coming in. And if they found guards, they would kill them for the most part, at least certainly the Russians would. So they went on these death marches. So in January of 1945, a very cold winter, my father was on a death march. Because you died very often just marching, or you were shot for not keeping up. So it was a 6-week march that got them to Bergen-Belsen. During that time, he met somebody from his town, and that guy basically said to him that I saw your wife in Auschwitz, and she was in the train ramp, and the children were taken away from her to go, obviously, to the gas chambers, and she wouldn't let go of them, so they took her too, and that was it. And then my father said, so I left the sweater on the floor there, and that was the end of the story. And that was the 20-minute story. And I believed it, and he believed it. And sadly, it wasn't exactly that way, because he was in a concentration camp when they were taken in Germany, 350 miles away. So he, I think, felt so much shame and guilt for surviving when he couldn't protect his children and his wife, that he had no choice but to come up with another way of thinking about it, that at least they tried. They didn't go into the rail cars without at least trying to escape. And that's what he carried with him. He carried that sweater, maybe with him in his head, maybe really with him, but he carried that story with him. And that became his only story about everything that happened in his life before then.
How old was your dad when he passed away?
He was 81. He died of Alzheimer's disease. I think mostly from the beatings that there were a number of testimonies that I discovered in the research of survivors of the camp that he was in, who talked about a particularly horrible guard, actually a criminal, who had beaten my father mostly with a club around his head many times during the course of his time there. And I think that's it. It's like the football concussions that we read about, and the Alzheimer's or dementia that results at an early age. Well, my father, I think it wasn't. I don't think it was a genetic thing. I think he had genetic problems with his cardiovascular diseases. But this was the result of a man beating him nearly to death many times. And he was so my father, never wanted to change anything in his life. He had a new family, and this is all that he cared about. And there were a great many arguments between my mother and father, because my father didn't want to try to get a better job. He didn't try to, he just wanted to do what he could for his new family and lead a peaceful life.
Mhm.
Uh,
Wow. So when
yeah.
you were doing all of this research, I mean, were there records somewhere that you were able to,
Yeah,
because I would imagine a lot of stuff was destroyed.
yeah, mostly it was destroyed, but they were old records, so I could find some records about where my parents were born, because we didn't know that. When they were born, we didn't know that. Uh, my mother would make up dates at will. My mother lived in her own world, which was a different kind of fantasy world than my father. My father, I think, besides that one story, lived in real life. This was reality, and he was going to make the most of it. My mother never accepted reality. My mother found other ways of dealing with her pain. She made up stories. She made up stories about her past that were totally untrue. And we came to believe those stories.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't make up stories too much about the concentration camps. That seemed to be actually real. If anybody who's listening saw Schindler's List, uh, Schindler's List was my mother's story, except that she wasn't saved by Oskar Schindler. But everything else that you see in Schindler's List happened to her as well. So the Krakow, the ghetto, this guy who was the Amon Get, who was the commander of the Plaszow concentration camp right outside of Krakow, where all the remaining Jews were sent after they liquidated the ghetto in 1943. So my mother would tell us, and our bedtime stories were about Amon Get shooting people at random. So she'd be standing, and the person next to her would suddenly be shot, and Get would be shooting with his hunting rifle from the balcony of his villa that overlooked the quarries of the Plaszow ghetto, of Plaszow concentration camp. So these were the stories, and Spielberg took those stories and created an extraordinary film. Which when I didn't want to see Schindler's List in 1994 when it came out, I didn't want to know. But my wife and kids said we should go, so we went, and it was the first time I actually got to understand at least better why my mother was the way she was. And it opened up door. And in fact, Spielberg used the tenement that my mother lived in Krakow, in Kazimierz, which was the Jewish quarter, as the central location for his filming of the Krakow ghetto. Because that really wasn't the Krakow, but her building was used, and her building then became a tourist destination for people who were coming to Krakow to go to Auschwitz, because Auschwitz is right outside of Krakow, or go to Krakow because it's a beautiful place to go to, or Schindler's Factory, which is also in Krakow. So, so we went there, and we saw where Spielberg filmed his film, and where my mother lived for 25 years. So
wow, that's
yeah.
So I have to go back to the bedtime stories. I mean, these are the stories your mom would tell you right before you fell asleep. So
Yeah,
I mean, how did that
the,
impact you? I mean, I
yeah, we're screwed up kids. What can I tell you? Well, what ended up happening was that we spent a lot of our time, again, trying to take care of them. So whenever there were films about any kind of war, we would turn the television off. We would wake them up when they had nightmares. We would try to intercede when they fought with each other about my father not being ambitious enough, and my mother wanting a life that she could never have. And then she would compare her life to Joseph Mengele into the
Oh.
selection. It was a constant battle between the past and the present. There was no future. And so I decided very early on that this was not for me. This was not the life it was not the life I saw on television, and even other kids didn't have this life that I knew. So I went into my own little fantasy world. My sister, who was older, was more influenced by my mother, and I unfortunately didn't do the things she wanted to do, but only what my mother wanted her to do, because my mother was trying to have my sister live the life my mother never had. So it was a complicated psychological mess. And
Okay, since you brought that up, did any of you ever seek counseling or help? Because I know
no,
that that
no,
wasn't the
no.
thing that that generation did, no matter what.
Yeah, no,
And
they were never, my parents were never offered any psychological help at
right.
all. They were, they, they got a small reparation check every month. Which the checks were about, when they were first issued in the mid 1960s, they were about $45 each a month. They were paid in Deutschmarks. Uh, and then you would go to the Lincoln Savings Bank and get them transformed. And they got more and more, but it was only because the dollar versus the Deutschmark exchange rates changed, and there was some inflation involved in all of it. But that was it. And so I decided that I would be somebody else. And so when I was about 7 years old, I started to go into Manhattan on the subway by myself. My father would be asleep. My mother and sister would be in downtown Brooklyn looking at stores. Not that they had any money to buy anything, but they would do that. And I would go into the city. I would get dressed up. I had a little bow tie. It was a whole little deal I had
And you
going.
were 7 years
Yeah,
old.
and I would carry a manila envelope because I saw people who went to work had like briefcases. We didn't have a briefcase. So we had them. So I found my father had a manila envelope, a big manila envelope, and I would carry it. And I would go into the office buildings and ride up and down on elevators. Once I panicked because I went to this, I remember this very well. I went to the sub basement of the Associated Press building in Rockefeller Center. I don't know how I got there, but I got to the sub basement, where the garbage I think was collected or whatever. And it was dark. And fortunately, I had the presence of mind not to stay or even to get out, and went back upstairs. But that's what I did. I did this for a long time.
I bet
And
you were absolutely adorable. And I'm sure you got a lot of attention. Did anybody ever stop you and say, "Hey,
no,
kid,
no, no,
are you
no.
lost?" Or
I didn't have to pay for it. I went in under the turnstile at the subways. No one paid any attention to me. This is New York, like who cares? Everybody is weird in New York. Uh, so that's what I did. My sister was more under the influence of my mother, as I said. So she ended up eventually becoming a kindergarten teacher. She didn't want to be. She ended up being sort of very social, which she not was not. It was a mess. It was a mess, and she only when after my mother died, or when she got much older, did my sister start her life again and
wow.
became a speech pathologist and did a lot of good things. But
Wow.
it was a strange little horror show. A friend of mine once said that you would go into our apartment and it would just be sad. And there was it was sad. I don't know how else to say it.
So now you've got your dad had his fantasy stories or his
Right.
stories in his head, and your mom had hers, and you had yours. Um, when you found out the truth, to especially like your dad's stories or your
Yeah.
mother's, were those the surprises that you were talking about at the very beginning of the?
Yeah, those were surprised. There were so many surprises. I was surprised by the fact, as I said, that they loved each other. I ascribed their relationship to the fact that they were lonely. I mean, here are these two people who meet and also in a camp. They met in a camp in Sweden. So they were both at Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war.
Mhm.
Bergen-Belsen was a horrible place at the end of the war. It was one of the, because all the other concentration camps were being emptied. And all those people went to Bergen-Belsen pretty much. So thousands and thousands of people were in Bergen-Belsen. All there was typhus and diphtheria and all kinds of diseases. There was no food. It was horrible. That's where Anne Frank and her sister died. And Anne Frank and her sister were in the same camp, within the camp as my mother at the time. And so it was a horrible, horrible place. My mother was there from October or November of 44 till April of 45, when the British came. And so I don't even remember why I was saying you that.
Well, the surprises, some of the surprises.
Oh, the surprises. So at the end of the day, my father writes a letter, and that's how the story begins. He writes a letter to a lawyer saying that he had fallen in love with a woman who was also named Friedman. So they were both named Friedman. And he was going to live with her no matter what. He was hoping to marry her, but he wanted to see if he could take her to America. Would that be possible? And I never saw them love each other. I saw them fight. I saw them tolerate each other. I saw them being partners as they were trying to raise us with meager resources. But I didn't see affection in particular. Except rarely. And it was the greatest surprise. I was so, in the course of this, there was a lot of bad things that we discovered, but this was such a delightful surprise that at least when they began in this journey, that there was this love, that there was this affection, that this was. And the cover of the book has them on a motorcycle. I mean, these two people are the last two people you'd ever see on a motorcycle. you would see them more in front of a motorcycle, but there it was, and that was the best surprise that I could have.
So
those kinds of things.
That really was a photograph of your parents on that
motorcycle?
Yeah,
so that's my parents. And interesting, that picture was taken 6 months after they had just been liberated from Bergen-Belsen. And it was 6 months before they got married. So they married 6 months later. They met around that time. So it was wonderful to find that picture and to identify where it might have been taken. We met, again, as I said, a niece that my father had from his first wife that we didn't know existed. We met a woman in Sweden who knew my parents and actually had pictures of my sister and me when we were babies in her attic, just by chance.
What a small world. That's crazy.
So there were many surprises along the way that were wonderful, and I guess sometimes you don't have enough tears for being happy or for being sad.
And that's what I was going to ask you next, was the emotional roller coaster in writing any kind of a book, especially a memoir, but one that is just, such a part of history. And so painful. And I'm sure, like you said, did I ever even really know my parents?
Yeah, exactly. Because
who are these people?
Right. And I think they had a hard time knowing who they were too. I think my father claimed to be a very religious person. And he certainly was religious when I knew him. He went to synagogue all the time. I had to go with him some of the time. And sometimes it was nice to do that because it was a nice way to be with him. But the fact is that if you look at the one picture we found of his family when he was about 17 or 18 in the book, you see an extremely assimilated group of people who, if you look at other pictures of the Orthodox Jews in Poland at the time, these people did not look like that at all. So my father, I think, found a way to adapt to the world as he needed. And if he needed, I think there was a faith in him that was ingrained. But I think when he needed to make money, when he needed to go to work or to find a job, he became whoever the people who were going to hire him wanted him to be. And I think when he said he was very religious, he was saying it to a guy who was taking him around, who was a religious guy in the United States who was translating for him. So he told him how he grew up like this and all that, and it wasn't the case. So he learned to adapt. And that was one of the ways I think he learned to survive, by adapting to whatever the circumstances were. And I think he was a happier person for that. And my mother, on the other hand, as I said, was fighting adapting. She couldn't take reality, and she couldn't. So she had a version of reality. Her story that was not true was that she and her first husband had a thriving dance studio in Krakow. That was her story. Her story was that one day the German soldiers came, knocked down the door of her apartment. She had a 5-room apartment with a maid, and they were making money hand over fist teaching dance. And that was her story. And we believed her story. That was a great story. We decided that that's why she was so hard on my father, that she actually had this other life, and now she was leading this miserable life with us. So, she lost really a lot. Well, in fact, there was no dance studio. In fact, we found papers that she had filled out in Sweden where, when they asked her, because they had to find a job for her after a while, when they couldn't find, there was no country that they could go to. So America wouldn't take them. They didn't want to go back to Poland. So they had nothing. They were stateless. They were sitting in Sweden. So they filled out forms to decide what kind of job could she get. And she said in that form that at the time that she was talking about her dance studio, she was a washerwoman. She was taking other people's laundry in for the equivalent of $2 or $3 a week to wash their clothes in her little bathtub. So this whole dance studio thing, her husband, she was married to this guy who was named Friedman for sure. And he made luggage, and he worked in a luggage store making the luggage that the Jews would take, the one piece of luggage that they would take to the concentration camps, where they would then leave the luggage. And that's why when you go to Auschwitz, you see these piles of luggage. So he was a luggage maker, not necessarily in cahoots with the Nazis, because they put him on a train too. But so all of this, that was a very big surprise, because we at least thought that we had a reason for the way she was behaving toward this very nice, sweet man that she had married, who she loved at one point, or it seemed to be. And yet she left this great dance studio. So that was a big surprise. We couldn't believe it. When we went to Poland, Jennifer and I, my wife, we were walking around looking, where was the dance studio? And we actually looked at a building. We said, that's it. That makes sense. The way she described it, where it was compared to where she was living, that's where it was. And then to find out that this was a major figment of her imagination.
Well, let me tell you something. As a lifelong dancer, I can tell you that nobody has a business that is so thriving that they're making money hand over fist.
Right.
So I really take my hat off for her imagination.
Right. If you think about it, she was living in the Jewish quarter of Krakow. So the Jewish quarter, And there was a slight reform movement, but mostly these were Orthodox Jews. So Orthodox Jews don't dance together, right?
Right.
Orthodox Jews don't. They don't touch women. So who was she teaching, and what was she teaching?
Mm.
And how did that all work out? It made no sense. She
Wow.
was living in that tenement next door with her husband in a little room next door to her parents, who also had another little set of rooms for her and her brothers.
But
But
what a
anyway,
lovely fantasy.
yeah, it was it, and she had other similar kinds of things that she would tell us, and they were tinges of truth to a lot of them,
Hmm.
because I think she liked to dance, but mostly not, mostly was this fantasy, and then my sister had to sort of become part of her fantasy,
Hmm.
and that was much more difficult for my sister. I just escaped.
Hmm. So now when you found the picture of the cover of the book, I wondered when I saw that if that was a real picture of your parents.
Yeah.
Um, and you had other pictures that you found. Do you have pictures in the book or more
Yeah,
pictures in the
the
book?
pictures there aren't that many pictures that we found, but the pictures that make sense are in the book.
Hmm.
Yes, they're all in the book.
Hmm.
Uh, and you get a sense of the time. What I tried to do in the book as well was to set everything in context. So there's a lot of history. I
Hmm.
hate to say, but there are a lot of footnotes
Hmm.
uh, there, so that you can look at the book and you can understand what life was like for
Hmm.
these people. What is the
Hmm.
context for what was happening to them, so that it isn't just their story; it's the story of the time that in
Hmm.
which they were living. And the second half of the book is basically we take them now in the United States. We came to America in 1952, and so now it's the four of us trying to deal with life with them. And
Hmm.
so that's the second half of the book, and that is it's not quite as heartbreaking as the first half. I mean,
Hmm.
we laughed a little. So
So how did you feel once it was finally published?
I I felt that I didn't know what I was going to do next, except I guess try to get people to read it. But uh, the I was very happy, but I keep trying to see if I could find out more still. There is
Hmm.
still more to be found. I mean, we decided that it was enough. It was
Hmm.
time to do something, to write it. I think every writer, sometimes research is fun because it delays the inevitable, which is actually sitting
Right.
down with a blank piece of paper and doing something with it that
Exactly.
that you'll be happy with. As it's easy to do something with it too. Uh, so so that's okay. And I've even been fantasizing about, and I wrote a short version of it. What if I if the Holocaust never occurred? What if they had the same first family? If my sister and I were never born, we didn't exist, because without them we wouldn't have existed, but that they lived with their first families,
Wow.
that everything else happened, but there was no World War II. There was anti-Semitism, there was a
Hmm.
state of Israel, there was America, there were a lot of the same things that happened, but it just wasn't this catastrophe.
Hmm.
Uh, so if what would have happened to them? So I wrote sort of a 20-page treatment of taking their lives and extrapolating it out till they get old, with two other spouses
It
and
sounds
children.
like a beautiful novel,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
coming up
And,
here.
and and at first I actually asked my publisher if we could insert it into the book as a separate insert. And we decided, and my wife and the publisher were correct. It would sort of demean what the book is about,
Exactly.
because
Exactly.
there was no happy ending.
Hmm.
That was real. This isn't. So the names and places would have to be changed so that it would be far enough away from the
Right.
reality to
Right.
allow those two realities to exist side by side.
Yeah, I
Maybe.
think it would be a great novel.
Yeah. Anyway.
So I'm here pushing you toward that just because I think it would be absolutely awesome. So I want you to be able to tell the audience where they can find your book and any other
Sure.
social media that, they can find you. And I do want you to talk about the organization that you do help promote.
Sure. So in terms of the book, it's on Amazon. There's an ebook or Kindle. There's a hardcover. There's a soft cover. I think the hardcover is on some special sale because they can't get rid of them, I guess. But in any case, there Amazon. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on BarnesandNoble.com as well. If you go into a bookstore and you ask them to order it for you, they can order it for you. It's there's a U.S. distributor. Uh, and you can go to my LinkedIn page. Just put my name in. You can go to my Facebook page. Just put my name in, and you'll see a little bit more about sort of what I've done before I wrote this book, and a little bit more about our family, and you'll see pictures of the family that ended up being a family when the first family was no longer. And you'll see a picture at the end of the book of the next family. And I would just urge people to understand that unfortunately the Holocaust is not an anomaly. That the world is a crazy, crazy, crazy place. We see it. Look at Ukraine. Look, one day the world is just, everything seems okay. I mean, when the Berlin Wall fell, we thought this was like the new Pax America coming to, and the world would be okay. We don't have to worry about nuclear weapons anymore. We don't have to worry about anything anymore. And yet, we turn around one day and everything changes. And I think that the takeaway from the book is that things can change dramatically in a heartbeat. And when the world is going in one direction and it's not the direction you think it should go, you have to do something about it because no one else is going to do it. You can't rely on the next person. I hope that people who read the book take the beginning of the book as just two strangers, people that you're not particularly interested in. They're not heroes in any sense. They're just ordinary people trying to live a relatively ordinary life, and yet they have to survive the unsurvivable. They have to endure the unendurable. They have to overcome the impossible. So how do you do that? The only way you do that is by feeling that there is something that you can aspire to, that you haven't lost your sense of respect for yourself. Even my mother, who was a fantasist of all sorts, she was a strong person. You have to be strong. You have to believe in yourself. And when you see something going on that you don't like, you have to do something about it. My mother saved one person in her family, her sister, and she saved that person during the selection at Auschwitz on the train ramp. During the selection, Joseph Mengele, and I confirmed that Joseph Mengele was indeed the person who, she would talk about him a lot, but in fact, he was the person who was doing the selection that day. She is selected to go one way. Her sister is selected to go the other way, left, right, whatever it was. And my mother looks at where her sister went, and she sees a lot of old people, and she sees a lot of children. She looks around her little group, and she sees young people her age, in their 20s, maybe 30s. She was actually older than a lot of these people. And she decides that something's wrong. She was very intuitive, and I think that's one of the things that saved her. And she ran over to the other side, to her sister, and pulled her to her side. And the dogs were set on them. The guards were beating them, but they just kept moving. They kept going, and her sister stayed with her through all the camps, and she ended up living 5 blocks away from us in Brighton Beach. And she also sadly didn't leave the world behind. She married somebody else, but she claimed for her entire life that she had a little girl, and she did have a little girl once, and that she was saving all the dolls. She would collect dolls, and she was saving all the dolls to bring back to this little girl who was living in Sweden now.
Oh my God.
So,
Oh.
You're surrounded by it, but you have to not give up. I mean, I think if I learned anything about this 5-year journey of trying to figure out what happened to them and therefore what happened to us in a way, is that that you don't give up. You just keep trying. You keep trying, and that's true of life. But when you see something that's going wrong, you have to try to do something about it. I don't think my parents could have done anything. Then they couldn't have done anything. They were these poor Jews who were just swept up in the arc of history. But that doesn't mean that has to happen to people in the United States or in Ukraine. They're fighting back. They saw something and they said, no, I don't care that it's Russia. This is our world, and they're not going to take it from us. And I think we have to think, when we look at anti-Semitism in the United States being out of control, that we need to do things about it. We need to support, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, places that are doing their best to educate people about what was and to warn them at what might be.
Well, Max, it has been an honor having you on the show today. I'm just blown away by your story. And, it's just a time in history that's just so painful. And I am so happy that you are sharing the stories, and all of the other people who've experienced it are getting the stories out there, because I think a lot of people just blow it off, or, oh, that really didn't happen. And it did. And it can happen again, because history does repeat itself.
Right. And I think if people just get a book like this one and meet people who are strangers, and by the end of the book, feel for these people, know that these are real human beings and that they suffer the same way anybody else suffers. And I think that what I've gotten from the people who read the book or commented on it is that at the end, they empathize with these people. They may not be able to walk in their shoes or even fit in their shoes, but they can understand the journey that they take, and they can say, that's something that we need to guard against in the future, and that we feel for these people, and I think that's the first step toward changing for a better world, is by feeling for other people and not sort of distancing yourself from them.
You made such a good point at the very beginning of the recording about, we hear these numbers, so many million people, and that gives us a way of being able to distance ourselves from it. But when you get to know these individuals, these people, their lives, how it was affected, I think that makes such a powerful impact.
I think so. I think once as I said, once I learned the names of my father's 2 little girls and his wife's name, everything changed. It was a surprise that I could even find that out, when they were born, where they were born, but just somehow knowing them, that somehow, because I shared their DNA as my father's DNA, so they're my blood relatives, whether I existed or not. So my sisters, my half sisters, whatever you want to call them.
Mhm.
And it just changes everything.
Mhm.
And I think we need to be shaken sometimes out of the mundane that world that we sometimes live in.
Mhm.
And I think if you read even almost any part of this book, pick it up at random, you'll begin to feel about
Mhm.
something that you maybe never thought about before.
Mhm. Well, I'm definitely getting the book. Like I said,
All
it's
right.
already in my cart. All I have to do is click buy. I'm really looking forward to reading it. It was just amazing, even reading the introduction and the prologue, whatever it was. It really moved me very much and really touched my heart. So,
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you gave me the chance to talk a little bit about this.
well, I loved hearing your story. I guess love is kind of like a strange word, but it's an incredible story and very powerful. And I really do believe a lot more people need to hear it.
But thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And everybody, thank you for listening. I really appreciate you as always. And do check out Max's book. You can go to Amazon and you can actually do the little look inside and you can read the prologue. And it's actually very powerful. And once you read that, you are going to want to read the book and make sure that you share it with your friends, with your family. It's a story that needs to be told. And remember, history does have a way of repeating itself. So be alert, be aware, and if you see something that's going on that doesn't seem right, take some kind of action. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.